They thought they were meeting heroes of the German resistance. Instead, the Gestapo was waiting, pins ready, guns hidden. Autumn, 1942. Berlin moved like a city under glass, polished, cold, suffocating. The air smelled of rain on cobblestones and coal smoke from chimneys that never seemed to rest. War posters flapped on the walls, shouting promises no one believed anymore. And in a basement office on Prinz Albrechtstrasse, a man named Walter Schellenberg stood over a map of Europe, tracing a thin red pencil line from Berlin to the Dutch border. Operation England Spiel, he said quietly. We opened the curtain. Across the continent, in the safer heat of Lisbon, British intelligence buzzed with whispers of something extraordinary. After years of fighting an invisible war, MI6 had received a message from within the Reich itself, from German officers claiming they wanted to overthrow Hitler. The letter was precise, polite, and astonishingly brave. They were requesting a meeting, neutral ground, a chance to negotiate contact with London. It was the kind of message no intelligence officer could ignore. The man chosen to handle it was Major Sigismund Payne Best, an elegant veteran of the previous war, fluent in German, meticulous, and perhaps too confident in the idea of honor among soldiers. Best believed in rules, even in chaos. There are still men of conscience, he said during the briefing in Lisbon. Even in Germany. The younger officers around the table exchanged uneasy looks. One of them, a radio operator named Collins, pushed a slip of paper toward him. Sir, he said, there's something odd in the code. Best studied it. A phrase near the end of the message, Der Apfel ist reif. The apple is ripe. It wasn't part of any MI6 cipher. Could be a signal, Collins muttered. Could be a trap. Best smiled thinly. Or it could end the war. That night, he wrote his own report to London, his handwriting crisp and optimistic. If this contact is genuine, we may be witnessing the first crack in Hitler's command. Request authorization to proceed. The answer came within hours. 2 words, proceed carefully. But no one was careful enough. In Berlin, the same phrase, Der Apfel ist reif, was written again, this time on a different piece of paper. It lay in front of Schellenberg, who drew a small circle around it with satisfaction. Our friends in London took the bait, he told his aide. Prepare the Dutch border. They like meetings, we'll give them one. He folded the paper neatly and placed it in a brown file marked England. Days later, Best boarded a car heading north through France, carrying forged diplomatic papers and a quiet excitement that bordered on faith. Beside him sat Major Richard Stevens, a reserved, sharp-eyed officer from the British Embassy in The Hague. They were to cross into neutral Netherlands for what MI6 would later call the Venlo contact. As the car rattled through Belgium, Best reread the letters, written in perfect English, signed with names that would later prove to be ghosts. He pictured the Germans who had written them, men in shadowed rooms, whispering treason against the Führer, risking everything for the chance to save their country. He wanted to believe such men existed. At the final checkpoint, Stevens adjusted his collar and said quietly, "If it's real, we could change everything." Best nodded. "If it's real." Back in Berlin, in a basement lined with radios and teleprinters, Schellenberg reviewed the final preparations. 2 agents from the Sicherheitsdienst, German intelligence, would pose as resistance officers. The meeting place, a quiet road near the Maas River on the Dutch side of the border, close to a cafe the British had used before. The plan was simple: make contact, earn trust, and capture. A junior officer entered the room, nervous. Herr Obersturmbannführer, what if the British suspect? Schellenberg looked up, his expression faintly amused. They won't. Hope blinds faster than fear. He turned back to the map, tapping the small town near the river with his pencil. Venlo, he said. That's where the empire loses its sight. The night before departure, Best couldn't sleep. The hotel room in The Hague smelled of rain and tobacco. He sat by the window, writing a last entry in his notebook. There is courage on both sides of this war. Perhaps tomorrow, we find the men brave enough to end it. Outside, a tram clattered by, sparks leaping from its wires. A dog barked once and went silent. In Berlin, at that same hour, Schellenberg's secretary locked a steel drawer. Inside lay a folder labeled simply Venlo. The top sheet bore a single sentence typed in black ink. 2 British agents expected. Capture priority 1. The The storm that would follow began not with bullets, but with ink. And on the morning of November 11th, 1942, the black Mercedes carrying Best and Stevens rolled quietly across the Dutch border toward Venlo. They didn't know the men they were about to meet didn't exist. They didn't know that within hours, they would vanish from Allied intelligence reports, replaced by a single line written in Berlin. Contact established. England spiel in motion. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel. They parked by the Maas River. Two men approached. And then, everything went silent. The morning of November 11th, 1942, came gray and brittle. A thin mist hung over the Dutch countryside, softening the outlines of trees and telephone poles into a watercolor of fog. The road near Venlo was empty except for one black Humber staff car, engine ticking faintly in the cold. Inside, Major Sigismund Payne Best and Major Richard Stevens sat in silence, their breath clouding the glass. The river murmured nearby, slow and brown, its surface broken by fallen leaves. Across the water lay the German border, an invisible line that, on a map, looked harmless. But everyone in the car knew better. Best checked his watch. 10:05. The meeting was already 5 minutes late. He adjusted his gloves, pretending calm. Stevens, younger and sharper, kept scanning the fog. They said 10 sharp, he muttered. They'll come, Best replied. Germans are precise people. The driver, a Dutchman named Jan Lemmens, stayed quiet, fingers tapping the steering wheel. He didn't like any of it. The air felt wrong. Too still, too watchful. Through the mist, movement. Two silhouettes emerged from the trees. Both in civilian coats, hats pulled low. One raised his hand in greeting. Her Best, I presume? The voice was smooth, practiced, friendly enough to lower a man's guard. Best stepped out, boots crunching gravel. Yes, he said, smiling faintly. And you must be. The second man reached into his coat. The world exploded. Gunfire cracked the air. The driver screamed. The windshield shattered in a glittering spray. Stevens fell sideways, shouting something lost in the noise. Best dropped to one knee, his ears ringing, tasting blood and cordite. 3 more men appeared from the fog, uniforms beneath their coats, weapons drawn. A black Mercedes roared up from behind the trees. Don't move, one shouted in perfect English. They never stood a chance. Within seconds, both British officers were disarmed, wrists bound. Lemmens, the driver, lay face down on the ground, moaning. The taller of the Germans crouched beside Best and spoke softly. You've traveled far, Major. Welcome to Germany. The words didn't make sense at first. Then Best realized he was already across the border. The ambush had been planned to the inch. The meeting spot, the timing, even the fog, all of it choreographed. The Germans hadn't crossed into Holland. They'd lured the British just far enough east for the kidnapping to count as legal under their own rules of war. By the time the Mercedes pulled away, the only things left at the river were a few shell casings and a single British shoe half buried in mud. The ride to Dusseldorf took hours. Rain streaked the windows, turning the landscape into gray ribbons. Stevens sat beside Best, his face pale, a dark stain spreading across his sleeve where glass had cut him. No one spoke. The German in front hummed a tune, something classical, almost cheerful. Best stared at the reflection of his own eyes in the window. They knew our names, he whispered. Even our passwords. Stevens nodded slowly. Then someone in London talked. Or we've been reading ghosts, Best murmured. Every letter, every signal, fed to us from the start. At the next checkpoint, the car stopped. Guards saluted, recognizing the insignia of the SD, the Sicherheitsdienst. One leaned toward the open window and said something that made the officer in the passenger seat smile. Best didn't understand the words, but he caught 2 of them clearly. Englandspiel Loft. Englandspiel is running. By nightfall they reached Dusseldorf. The prisoners were led down a narrow corridor lined with concrete walls and no windows. A single bulb swung overhead. Best stumbled once. A guard caught his arm, not unkindly, and said, Careful, Herr Major. You're valuable. They were separated, searched, and locked in adjoining cells. Hours passed. Then footsteps. The door opened, and a man in an immaculate SS uniform stepped in, hands behind his back, expression polite. Major Best, he said in flawless English, you and your colleague have caused us considerable effort. But we must thank you. You've made our work so much easier. Best straightened, forcing calm. Who are you? Walter Schellenberg, the man said, almost pleasantly. Head of Foreign Intelligence. He sat down opposite the British officer, crossing one leg over the other. Tell me, Major, did London ever suspect? Best didn't answer. Schellenberg smiled. No, of course not. They believe they've been speaking with patriots of the German resistance. Fine men, noble dreams. We even used your own codes. Quite convincing, don't you think? He reached into his coat and produced a single sheet of paper. Typed neatly across the top, Venlo Report. Beneath it, the British agents' names, ranks, and mission summaries. Details no one outside MI6 should have known. Best's mouth went dry. You've intercepted us. Intercepted? Schellenberg chuckled. Major, we've been riding half your war. He stood, slipping the report back into his pocket. You'll be treated well. After all, you've become, what's the word, indispensable. When the door closed again, Best sat perfectly still, staring at the wall. Somewhere down the corridor, he could hear Stevens shouting, then a guard's barked order, then silence. In the next cell, a radio clicked on briefly, Morse signals tapping faintly through the concrete, the sound of communication that might have been real or just another layer of deceit. At that moment, Best understood what Schellenberg meant. The trap wasn't just the ambush at the river. It was everything after, the illusion that would go on living long after they were captured. Somewhere in London, someone would soon receive a telegram, apparently from him, saying, meeting successful, resistance strong, awaiting supplies. And by the time anyone questioned it, dozens more lives would already be in the hands of the Gestapo. That night, in a room without windows, Major Payne Best wrote his first and last field note on a scrap of toilet paper and hid it behind a crack in the wall. The meeting was a trap. They knew everything. England's spiel has begun. The British think their agents are sending messages from safe houses in Holland, Schellenberg said, crushing his cigarette in the tray. In truth, every word comes from this basement. Winter 1943. Berlin was stone and smoke. Frost on tram lines, the air thick with cold dust. In the Gestapo's headquarters on Prinz Albrechtstrasse, 3 men sat before a British transmitter captured in Venlo. The hum of the machine mixed with the ticking of a wall clock. A stack of coded messages lay open, each signed with names of men who were already dead. The operator, pale and sharp-fingered, tapped the key carefully. He even mimicked human error, one mistyped letter, one missing symbol. The British had trained their agents to add a bluff check to prove they weren't sending under duress. The Germans learned to skip it just often enough to seem real. Tap. Pause. Tap. Successful landing. Locals cooperative. Request 3 supply containers. Across the channel, in a gray office at 64 Baker Street, the message was read aloud to applause. Holland network restored, an officer said, eyes bright with relief. On the wall, new pins were pushed into a map of Europe. Reports spoke of sabotage, recruitment, success. None of it was true. Every word London trusted came from a Gestapo typewriter. In Berlin, Schellenberg reviewed the latest intercepted drop list, explosives, radios, money. We'll collect them ourselves, he said dryly. A clerk marked each delivery received. The operation had a name now, England Spiel. The English game. Parachute drops continued. Agents arrived in Dutch fields and were immediately surrounded. The Germans met them smiling, speaking perfect English, sometimes using the names of already captured comrades. Radios were seized, codes copied, and the game went on. In London, the tone of messages raised no alarms. The operators in Berlin studied handwriting, phrasing, even jokes. One fake transmission began with, "Tell mother I'll bring cheese." Only 2 people in the world knew that phrase, both now prisoners. By spring, the Gestapo's map of Holland was full of red dots. Each marked a team successfully landed and already captured. London, unaware, approved more agents. Hope made them blind. A junior officer in the cipher section wrote a quiet memo, messages too consistent. No complaints, no failures. Unnatural. His note was filed and forgotten. In war, good news was currency, and no one questioned profit. The radio room in Berlin became almost theatrical. Operators called it the stage. They drank coffee, joked about London's naivety, and signed each fake cable with the captured agents' names, their ghosts speaking faithfully on command. Sometimes they sent two at once to simulate teamwork. Sometimes they wrote in code errors just to stay believable. Let London believe, Schellenberg reminded them. Faith is the softest target. By midsummer, SOE had lost more than 50 agents in Holland. Dozens of Dutch civilians who had helped them vanished into camps. In London, senior officers toasted the heroes of the Dutch resistance, sending commendations to men who were already dead. On one evening in June, a colonel read a cable aloud. Operation progressing well. Morale high. Expect major success soon. Everyone in the room clapped. Someone even said, God bless them. That same message arrived in Berlin 2 hours later. A clerk unfolded it, smiled, and pinned it to the wall outside the cells where Best and Stevens were kept. It read like a letter of gratitude. To our brave agents. The prisoners never saw it, but the guards laughed as they passed by. Down the corridor, one captured radio operator pressed his fingers against the wall, tapping faint Morse. 3 dots, 3 dashes, 3 dots, SOS. The sound died in the stone. No one in London heard. The city there was too loud with celebration. By the end of 1943, England's Spiel had become a perfect illusion, a ghost army run from a German basement. And when the British finally began to doubt, it was already too late. Because by then, every secret they still trusted belonged to the enemy. Every message from Holland sounded right. Every word felt real, except for one detail no one noticed. Spring 1943. London wore the tired calm of a city at war. The nights were still punctured by sirens, the mornings by hope. Inside 64, Baker Street, the headquarters of the Special Operations Executive, typewriters clicked like mechanical rain. Radios hummed, code clerks hunched over headphones, and the smell of coffee and wet wool hung thick in the air. To the men and women in those rooms, the Dutch network was their crown jewel. Reports from the field spoke of sabotage, courage, and cooperation. The cables from agents in Holland arrived on time, their codes immaculate, their tone steady. The SOE officers took pride in the precision. No network runs this clean, one supervisor said proudly. Not even the French. No one questioned why it was so clean. Across the North Sea, the illusion was perfect. In a field near Rotterdam, a Gestapo convoy waited beneath blackout tarps. The night was windless. In the distance, the sound of an approaching plane grew louder. A young German officer checked his watch, then turned to his men. They'll drop right on schedule, he said. At exactly 2:13, the sky cracked open. Parachutes blossomed in the darkness like pale flowers. The first agent hit the ground, rolled, and looked up just in time to see floodlights slice through the mist. Welcome to Holland, said a voice in English. Machine guns didn't fire. They didn't need to. The agent froze, hands raised. Around him, shadowy figures closed in, polite and efficient. One even helped him to his feet, brushing dirt from his coat. We'll take you to your friends, the German said. The trap had worked again. By dawn, the new prisoner was sitting in a small interrogation room, staring at a list of names the Gestapo already knew. His own name was at the top. They showed him his coded phrases, his family details, even the jokes he'd used in radio messages. How did you get these? He whispered. The officer smiled. You told us, he said simply, and left the room. In Berlin, Walter Schellenberg read the latest reports with the calm satisfaction of a craftsman perfecting a design. The English don't doubt, he told his staff, because they want to believe. That's our greatest weapon. He ordered another batch of forged messages to be sent to London. The Germans had learned to imitate not just language, but rhythm. Every hesitation, every overconfident word, every flicker of human imperfection. The deception had become a living thing. Meanwhile, in Baker Street, the atmosphere was almost celebratory. Every telegram from Holland seemed to confirm what they wanted to hear. The resistance was growing. The Germans were losing control. One officer, reading a cable aloud, said, "They're unstoppable, sir. Truly unstoppable." "Then give them what they need," came the reply. More drops, more men. And so, night after night, planes took off from English airfields carrying brave men and precious cargo, straight into German hands. In April 1943, a coded note arrived in London. Request additional transmitters. Urgent. The handwriting matched, The code checked out. The operators confirmed authenticity. SWE sent 12 new sets, each neatly packed, each waiting to be captured. Later, a surviving agent named Jack Winston would write, "They even used our jokes, the small things we thought only friends knew. When I heard my own words repeated back to me, I realized they'd been reading my life like a play." The illusion grew so vast that even when oddities appeared, a missed phrase, an unfamiliar turn of humor, no one in London dared to question it. Success had its own gravity. To doubt was to slow the war, to lose faith. But under the pride, cracks began to form. A handful of clerks noticed strange patterns. Reports always phrased the same way. Messages always arrived exactly on schedule. The agents never made mistakes, never complained, never broke rhythm. Too perfect. One evening, a radio operator named Evelyn Carter whispered to her colleague, "Doesn't it seem rehearsed?" He shrugged. "Maybe they're just that good." No one wanted to be the person to break the spell. In May, Schellenberg added a new instruction. Agents who resisted interrogation were to be treated with professional respect. Their voices were valuable. Their courage made the illusion stronger. Some prisoners were forced to dictate new codes, convinced it might save others. None realized their words were being rewritten before the ink dried. By the end of the summer, every British supply route to Holland belonged to the Gestapo. The fake network was so effective that it began to confuse even the Germans themselves. "We have too many agents," one officer joked. "We'll have to start inventing enemies for them to fight." In London, the radio room celebrated record success. There were speeches, even a toast. "To our men in Holland," said a senior officer, glass raised. "They're winning this war one signal at a time." The crowd cheered. No one noticed the small omission in every message. The missing security check mark that was supposed to prove a sender wasn't under duress. For months, the absence went unseen. Until one night in December 1943, a young intelligence clerk noticed it while cross-referencing transmissions. She frowned, traced the dots and dashes with her pencil, and said quietly, "Something's wrong." And for the first time in a year, silence fell over Baker Street. Because if she was right, it didn't just mean their agents were in danger. It meant they'd already been gone for a very long time. It was a small mistake, one tiny that betrayed an empire. Winter pressed London flat. Frost webbed along Baker Street windows. Coal smoke mixed with damp wool in the corridors of SOE. Radios ticked like nervous metronomes. In a side room where breath showed in the air, a junior officer named John Peck hunched over a stack of Dutch transmissions and a battered codebook stained with tea. He ran a pencil across the groups, tracing habits only long hours could teach. Cadence, favorite abbreviations, the private quirks that made senders sound human. Something didn't add up. Each SWE operator in the field was trained to embed a tiny, prearranged proof. One character, one dot, or a swapped pair, different for each man, and always present unless he was under duress. The security check mark. Holland's messages were flawless. Too flawless. Not one included its check. Not once in months. Peck stared, then counted again. He pulled earlier sheets, lined them by date, traced the gaps like a surgeon mapping arteries. His throat dried. He went to the window and pressed a palm to the cold pane as if the glass could steady him. Then he picked up the folder and walked. The corridor to the senior's office felt longer than usual. He knocked. Major Stanley looked up from a tray of cables, impatience tucked under his politeness. "Well," Peck set the papers down, spread them carefully, and tapped the margins where the checks should have been. "Sir, they're all wrong. Every Dutch message since last year is missing the mark." Stanley barely glanced. Operators forget. Cold fingers. Nerves. "Not every time. Not across every sender," Peck said, voice steadier than he felt. "Sir, they're all fake." Silence collected like frost. A clock clicked twice. From the wireless room next door came the cheerful stutter of a new signal. "Impossible," Stanley said finally. "We'd know." Peck met his eyes. "Would we?" He laid down the memoranda. Small anomalies ignored for weeks. Perfect timing, identical phrasing, success without friction. "War isn't this neat," he said. "It never is." Stanley's face had drained of color. He sat back slowly, as if lowering himself into cold water. "If you're right," he murmured, "we've been feeding the enemy with our own hands." By evening, the room filled, section heads, cipher officers, a minister's aide with a jaw set hard against panic. They read the samples, traced the missing marks, argued in circles, then stopped arguing because the arithmetic didn't bend. Someone swore under his breath. Someone else whispered, "God help us." A clerk brought in the day's inbound from Holland. Stanley didn't open it. He placed it on the table like a relic of a faith just lost. "No replies," he said hoarsely. "Not a word." In a back office, a typist found the courage to speak what the graphs already shouted. "We kept communicating after they were taken," she said. "We kept sending men." The sentence shook in the air, a verdict and an epitaph. Months later, the official report would admit it with brutal brevity. "We continued communications for months after all agents were compromised." That night, Peck walked out into the brittle cold, the city's lamps smeared by fog. He could not shake the image. Parachutes opening over Dutch fields like white flowers, men landing into circles of waiting uniforms, radios boxed and labeled, the enemy answering London in voices that were not their own. In the canteen, a senior officer stared into his tea and said to no one, "The Gestapo didn't destroy us. Our faith did." No one contradicted him. Orders went out quietly. No more drops without fresh checks. No more blind trust in tidy triumphs. The radio room slowed to a human pace. Doubt, late, necessary, took a chair. But cables already sent cannot be unsent, and names already spoken cannot be unlearned. Somewhere east, winter light fell on concrete yards and wire. The men London still toasted as in the field were counting steps between walls, listening for news that would not come. A guard's boots clicked. A door opened. A list was read. Peck folded the last transcript and slid it into a brown envelope marked Inquiry, Urgent. His pencil snapped in his fingers. He didn't notice. Because even as London finally spoke the word compromised, a train was grinding south through the snow, its windows rhymed, its cargo silent. Its destination had a name everyone in Europe knew and no one spoke easily. And inside, among thousands of prisoners, the missing voices of Holland were waiting for a message that would never arrive. In the silence of Dachau, a British agent wrote his last message, not in code, but in blood. Spring 1944 came colorless to the camp north of Munich. The air smelled of damp straw, carbolic, and smoke that never explained itself. Inside Block 7, men counted time by footsteps and chow calls, by the way light thinned across the floor and climbed the opposite wall. Their faces were winter-thin even when the days turned mild. A guard's keys scraped a rail. Somewhere a man coughed in a rhythm that refused to change. They were SOE and Dutch resistance, a few French, 2 Norwegians with sailors' hands, transmitters once, now numbers on cloth. They listened for radios that weren't there, hearing the phantom stutter of keys in their sleep. Among them sat Lodewijk van den Berg, a Dutch operator taken in one of the early harvests of England's Spiel. Small-boned, quick-eyed, he had memorized more call signs than prayers. His fingers, unasked, still tapped against his thigh. Dash, 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 like a heart reminding itself. New arrivals brought rumors in their shoes. London suspected. London didn't. The Dutch section was compromised. No, the Germans were bluffing. Truth arrived in scraps, contradicted itself, and dissolved under the lights-out whistle. One afternoon, a capo shoved open the door and called a name. Van den Berg stood. The walk to the Schreibstube, the office with the typewriter, was short, but the corridor made it feel like a mile. The clerk behind the desk wore spectacles and an expression borrowed from a bank. "Right?" he said, pushing paper and a pencil stump forward. "A letter. We stamp." Van den Berg's hand trembled once and stilled. He wrote slowly, like a man soldering a wire. "My dear Anna, tell our boy that the radio still sings in my head. Tell him it is a good song, and it keeps me warm when nothing else does. I am safe enough to think of you. That is all a man needs." The clerk read it, nodded, and set it aside in a stack that would never leave the camp. Months later, when American soldiers opened a desk drawer, they found the letter with others, edges stuck with damp and time. The line about the radio was underlined in a stranger's pencil. Back in Block 7, the men measured one another by what they refused to surrender. A French courier taught them to knot scraps of cloth into chessmen. A Brit named Ellis carved a queen from bread and hid it under his mat like contraband hope. At night, they traded stories from home, learning each other's daughters' names by whisper. One guard, older, the limp of an Eastern Front winter in his step, sometimes paused at the door. He had been Wehrmacht before the gray uniform and the skull badge. "You fought clean," he said once, not looking at anyone in particular. "I hope someone remembers that." Then he moved on, as if the sentence had burned his mouth. The cruelty was procedural rather than loud. Orders came down, each with the dryness of paper. Twice a week, a list went up. Names were read without verbs. Men left in pairs and didn't return. The ones who stayed learned not to ask the future any questions. Then came the morning of the last transmission. They woke early to the metallic weather of dread. An SS officer with a narrow chin and clean boots came to Block 7 with two men carrying a crate. He spoke in the tone of a man giving a demonstration. "For the British," he said in German-accented English, "a chance to speak to London." They set the set on a table, black case, familiar dials, the ghost of English fingerprints still in the scratches. Every head in the room turned. Even the air tried to draw closer. The officer looked at Van den Berg. "You. Hands." They didn't chain him. It was worse that they didn't. He sat, touched the key, and for a second the world rearranged itself into something he understood. The guard with the limp shifted, then went very still. "Send," the officer said. "Tell them the mission proceeds. Tell them spirits are high." His smile was tidy. "Be convincing." Van den Berg's fingers hovered, then began to work. Tap, tap, pause, tap. Each group a small act of treason against despair. He smuggled what he could into cadence, an extra breath, a human seam, hoping some unseen pair of ears in London would hear the tremor behind the words and flinch. The SS man nodded, satisfied, when the final AR went out. In Baker Street, on a damp morning that smelled of rain and carbon paper, a woman at the wireless table copied the message and passed it on. A supervisor, half believing now, still wrote in the margin, "Good morale noted." The paper traveled 2 doors and gained a second note. "Well done, Holland." No one saw the space where a tiny check mark should have been. Back in the block, the radio was boxed and carried away like a trophy returning to its shelf. The officer clicked his heels and left. The men breathed again in a broken wave. Someone made a joke no one laughed at. That night, Van den Berg used the sliver of mirror he kept to trim his beard. The glass caught a triangle of window and a star that had found its way past the wire. "Anna," he said under his breath, as if sound could slip between latitudes. "Tomorrow I will be on the air again." He wasn't. 2 days later the list went up. 3 names. His was second. He shook hands with Ellis and the French courier, who tucked the bread queen into his palm with a gambler's sleight. "For luck," the Frenchman said. "For rank," Ellis corrected, managing a smile. The guard with the limp walked them out. In the yard, the gravel made a dry sound that would, forever after, mean goodbyes. Near the gate, the older man spoke from the side of his mouth. "The world will be different," he said, a sentence too small for what it tried to hold. "Make it so if you can." Van den Berg nodded. "We built voices out of silence," he said. "Maybe someone will hear us after all." They did not come back. Weeks later, crates were inventoried, rooms cleared, names crossed out. In London, after the reckoning began, someone found the transcript of that last cheerful message and stapled it to a memorandum titled "Compromise Confirmed." The staple went through the word spirits. By summer, the Germans in the capital were burning paper or boxing it, neat bundles labeled for departure. In a cellar on Prinz Albrechtstrasse, a clerk tied up the YNGLANDSPAL files with cotton string, humming off key. His supervisor added a final note. "Use remaining London confidence for concluding action." An officer underlined concluding. In Dachau, the radio never came back, but sometimes, late, when the stove ticked as it cooled, the men swore they heard a faint tapping wander the walls like rain. Ellis pressed his ear to the plaster and whispered, "Ready when you are, mate." Across the channel, Baker Street's doubts hardened into facts no one wanted. New orders were drafted, new rules taught. But the wire had already sung its last song in too many rooms that smelled of lime wash and fear. And while London gathered its shame into folders, the Gestapo opened a fresh one. Its cover blank, its plan precise, its promise simple. They would make one more delivery. One more drop that looked like mercy and tasted like ash. They found the truth in rooms that smelled of wet plaster, cold ash, and ink that had outlived its authors. Berlin, May 1945. Walls knocked open like broken teeth, floors powdered with brick and soot. The Allied document teams moved through the ruins with canvas bags and pencils tucked behind ears, tagging what could be saved before the rain finished what fire had started. In a cellar off Prinz Albrechtstrasse, behind a door pried up with a bayonet, they found the filing cabinets. A captain from the U.S. Counterintelligence Corps read the labels aloud as if they might rearrange themselves into something gentler. Funknetze, radio networks, Holland, ENGLANDSBAL. He set a box on a trestle table, wiped his hands on his trousers, and lifted the lid. Inside, the papers were orderly in the way only a bureaucracy can make murder. Typed summaries with neat margins. Photographs clipped at the corner with nickel teeth. Carbon copies still smudging. One report held his eye, stripped of adjective and remorse. Operation England Spiel. 54 agents neutralized, 50 executed, 0 escapes. He read it twice, then a third time, hoping the numbers might break under repetition. They didn't. He passed the page to a British major who had not slept much in a week. The major stared at the digits as if they were coordinates to a grave he'd already visited. A lieutenant from the team began laying out cables that had crossed the channel years earlier and been answered from this very basement. The German clerks had kept them like trophies. London's cheers underlined in pencil, fake Dutch signatures matched to the day's weather. One telegram lay on top, preserved in a plastic sleeve. The British major's hands paused over it before he slid it free. To our brave agents. Exemplary work under impossible conditions. London is proud. Continue transmissions. There was a laugh in the room. Short, wrong, a sound someone made to prevent something worse. The captain held up another sheet from the same folder. Execution lists, typed with the same ribbon, dated the same week. Gratitude and death warrants married by a staple. They kept reading. One memo described how to omit the security check mark with natural irregularity. Another noted which English phrases to use to sound tired but optimistic. There was even a page of jokes filed under morale. The men at the table read until the light failed and the smell of damp paper turned their mouths metallic. Elsewhere in Berlin, in a safer room with intact windows, a British officer opened a courier pouch stamped MI6, return. Inside lay copies of internal minutes from 1943, approval stamps, requisitions, commendations. He put them side by side with the German logbooks taken that morning. The dates lined up like teeth in a gearbox. He took off his glasses, rubbed the indentations from the bridge of his nose, and did not put them back on for a long time. When Payne Best was returned to Allied hands that summer, thin, formal even in ruin, he spoke carefully, like a man testing floorboards he could not see. Later, in a paragraph that outlived most of his generation, he wrote, "The war taught me that trust is the sharpest weapon, and it cuts both ways." The sentence looked plain on the page, stripped of theater, which made it harder to ignore. In London, Baker Street cleared its bulletin boards. Pins came out of maps with small, apologetic clicks. The wireless room went quiet enough to hear the clocks. A committee drafted an accounting that read like a confession written by a city. We continued communications for months after all agents were compromised. It was stamped, initialed, distributed to men who had already guessed each word. Families arrived in offices that smelled of rain and polish. They were shown clean summaries. Some brought photographs, a son on a bicycle, a husband beside a hedgerow, a brother with ink on his fingers, and a grin. The officials spoke softly, careful with tenses, was, were, had been. No one mentioned the telegram of thanks found beside the execution lists. No one needed to. The room knew it anyway. Back in Berlin, the document team boxed the files, tied them with cotton string, and wrote dates in a steady American hand. The captain who had read the numbers carried the ENGLANDSBAL box himself up the stairs, breathing the lime dust air as if it might burn the memory out of him. At the top, he paused and looked back at the doorway singing Weak with Wind. "Close it," he said, carefully. Years later, the story would settle into books, timelines, maps, an index of names that tried to stand in for faces. Students would learn about deception and counter-deception, about codes and missing marks. They would underline key sentences, then turn the page. The world had other lessons to memorize. But for those who handled the papers while the mortar dust still drifted, the lesson was something quieter and less comfortable. It was not only that the Gestapo had tricked London. It was that London had been ready to be tricked, had wanted the good news so fiercely that it forgot how truth sounds when it is frightened. The true tragedy of England's spiel was not simply that the enemy wrote our messages. It was that, for too long, we read them with relief instead of suspicion, and sent men into that relief until it had no room left for their names. In the end, the files closed with a dry whisper. The city exhaled. And somewhere between the river and the ruins, the air kept one last echo of keys that had tried to warn across stone, a rhythm almost like a heartbeat, almost like a prayer, and far too late to save anyone at all.